All right, so there is an exam up now on viruses, and there's a little bit on there relating to prions. So, sure that you reviewed the PowerPoint on that viruses, and watch the lectures that I posted. Take notes on those. Review that material. The due date on that exam is on the 16th of April, so that's a week. I'm going to adhere to that. Okay, so don't miss the exam. Now, it'll go down on the 16th at midnight or 11:59 p.m. So you have 120 minutes to take it. You got a couple of attempts. Um, it is not quite 40 questions long. It's all multiple choice. All right, so hopefully there won't be any issues with that. All right. So if there are, let me know. Um, so now we're going to go ahead on. I'm going to post this lecture, and hopefully you'll find time to get into this material too. It's as we're all finding out, really a challenge to do these things from home, and I'm struggling with just horrendous allergies and that sort of thing. So I'm doing my best here. So anyway, let's jump into it. I'm going to go ahead and pull up this PowerPoint. All right, and this is from chapter 7 on microbial nutrition, ecology, and growth. That is population growth, that's what we're talking about. So I won't go through this entire PowerPoint in one sitting, but a chunk of it, and then post some more lectures on this, and try to get another exam up on this material shortly. So I know it's piling on, but you've got time now to hopefully um, you'll. So anyway, let's get started on it. All right, so a lot of people who work in a clinical setting um, don't pay as much attention to this as some other folks do. There is a whole field now, by the way, of microbial ecology where people study microbes out in nature, how they function there. We're finding that they're incredibly important. And I've made this point before that without bacteria and other microbes, life as we know it wouldn't be possible, right? Even though occasionally they turn on us and do some devastating things. In the grand scheme of things, they are pivotal in our success on this planet. You're carrying mitochondria in all of your cells. Well, they were originally free living bacteria. So we owe bacteria some sort of respect just for that alone. But there are many other things that they provide. And this is not simply bacteria, but also the fungi and viruses and other forms as well, certainly the protistans. So ecology, very broadly, there's lots of different ways to define it. If you look at many different textbooks, each one will have their own little slant on it. But the study of interactions between organisms and their environment, how organisms respond to environmental changes, and how in turn organisms affect the environments that they live in. Right? So it's it's all of those things, and uh, we're going to deal with some aspects of it. Certainly not a comprehensive coverage, but some aspects of ecology. The interactions that we're talking about involve not only living things, microbes themselves, but non-living things too. So a living thing, for example, has to deal with changes in temperature. The temperature is a physical factor, certainly non-living, um, that the living organism will have to deal with. So there's an example of an ecological interaction. Um, Living things will have to deal with um, the ions and other kinds of molecules that are in their surroundings. Water. something that they're going to have to be able to deal with. If you're a small single-celled bacterium and you're living in fresh water, it's likely that you're going to take on extra water just due to osmosis because her cytoplasm is more hypertonic than the surrounding water. So there's an interaction there. Organisms are going to have to deal with that. And, it goes both ways. Sometimes living things affect the non-living aspects of their environment by releasing wastes and modifying chemicals in their surroundings. So anyway, ultimately the survivorship of members of a population, their reproduction, and then even the evolution of populations of organisms are going to be things that will come about as a result of these interactions. We're going to talk about the different types of interactions. I've just very broadly overviewed some aspects of them, but there's competition. So organisms competing with one another would involve them trying to get at some limiting resource, something that's very much needed by organisms, but in short supply. If that's the case, and you have two or more kinds of organisms vying for that resource, they're in competition. And then we have parasitism. That's where one organism or microbe, it doesn't necessarily have to be a living thing, as we're dealing with now, viruses, which are non-living, but some sort of microbe that enters the body of an organism, or maybe even just resides on its surface and utilizes some of the resources that are found there, and thereby gain an advantage. They increase in number at the expense of whatever the host is. So that's parasitism. And then predators usually are big things that eat smaller things. So there's killing and eating going on here. So in that sense, predation is unique. But in other ways, parasitism and predation are similar. You got one organism gaining and another one losing. So there's that. And then we have mutualists. These are two or more organisms that live together and provide benefits for one another. So their living together is sort of mutually advantageous. It's a win-win situation for everybody involved. So you have those kinds of interactions. Predators and prey, those two go together. If you're a prey organism, you're on the losing end of that type of interaction. And then commensals. These are organisms that live together, one of them gaining and the other one neutral. So if you have an organism, say, living in your gut right now, and you can't ascribe any benefit that you gain from that, or conversely, any disadvantage, say infection resulting in disease that comes from that, so you're neither gaining or losing, you're carrying around an organism that's just a commensal. It's just hitchhiking there, and it's loving life in your gut, but you're none the worse for wear for having it. So all of these can be represented with pluses and minuses. So like in the case of competition, both individuals of a particular competitive engagement are, there might be one that wins ultimately, but it's a struggle for both of them. And so had they not competed, they wouldn't have wasted any energy in competitive interaction. So in competition, the competing organisms, whether they're of different species or the same species, it's a struggle for both of them. So we could indicate that with two minuses. It's kind of a lose-lose proposition. In the case of parasites, plus minus, the parasite gets the plus. The host that's being attacked by the parasite, being utilized or exploited by the parasite would be a better way. that host is diminished somewhat. May not be killed outright, but it's certainly not going to be as capable of making a living as it would otherwise. Same with predators and their prey. A predator that is successful wins. Prey that is not successful dies. And so that's necessarily always the case in predator-prey interactions. And then the mutualists, if you've got two mutualist forms, they both do better together than either would individually. That's a plus plus. Then a way to represent commensalism would be plus for the commensal organism, the one that's living on or in a host, but not harming the host or helping it either. So that's a plus zero type of relation. That way. That's a neat way to kind of symbolize these and maybe remember them a little easier. But ecologists are interested in those interactions, trying to, really fully investigate those and know more about them as they occur in nature. All right, so this little picture here is an interesting one. It shows different kinds of environments, different things going on in them. So these are all kind of backgrounds for ecological interaction. And so you got up here the atmosphere, sun up there, but it's sitting up in the sky, and you've got around our planet an atmosphere, a gaseous portion of the planet where there's water vapor and there's oxygen and there's carbon dioxide and so forth. So light passing through that atmosphere is going to impinge the Earth's surface and is going to affect things. And we've got organisms that have evolved to be able to use that light. So we've got these photosynthetic organisms. They in turn produce organic molecules using that energy, and those serve as the base of energy for all other organisms. So you could say that life is a gift from the sun if you're prone to poetic kinds of descriptions of things, and in fact that's pretty much true. And then you've got non-photosynthetic organisms. They are likewise going to be affected by the atmosphere. There's oxygen that's given off by photosynthesis, so the abundance of that oxygen is going to either promote their success, or if it's low supply, if you don't have enough oxygen, it's going to promote their decline. They're not going to be able to do it well. So the atmosphere is very important. Number of components of that: light, gases, and water vapor, and so on, that affect organisms around Earth. And by the way, so this is the atmosphere. Sorry, horrible writing with my finger. Plus, I got a dog on my lap that won't leave me alone. I got these different spheres. So the atmosphere is important for living things. And the part of the planet, right, which goes up into the atmosphere for some distance and goes down into the earth and into the oceans for some distance, part of our planet, the part of our world where living things occur, is another one of those spheres. So that is the biosphere. All right. So now down in this picture here, we've got an ocean. So oceans and lakes and rivers and ponds and all these bodies of water, all of these watery places make up the hydrosphere. Not a root here. The hydro is how that is pronounced, hydrosphere. And of course, water is a non-living thing, but is essential for life on the planet. It has properties which provide the context within which life has arisen. And without it, life as we know it wouldn't be possible. So we've got a hydrosphere. Living within that, we've got microbes that are, many of them single-celled, or they might exist in small colonies, clusters. This little picture shows a number of those. They're incredibly important. Some of them, These green ones, for example, are photosynthetic and going to provide tremendous amounts of oxygen, even though collectively their bodies don't weigh that much. They're important photosynthesizers. And the reason they can be so small, of course, is that they overcome the effects of gravity by floating in water, right? Whereas land-living photosynthetic forms, the plants, tend to be much, much larger. They need that reinforcement involving tissues that help them to stand up and be elevated so they can get light. Aquatic microbes don't have to deal with that. Anyway, there's that. Then you got a terrestrial soil community, and there are microbes that live in the soil. So those places are described as being terrestrial. That's a word that maybe you don't have in your toolbox in vocabulary, but know that word. So terrestrial settings are home to lots of microbes. You can see a whole community of things in the soil particle. You got, the blue in here is water, little H2O droplets. You've got organic matter, which is non-living detritus. Okay? So you got water and detritus. But there's, particles of inorganic clays and so on that are in there, combined with the organic material to form that soil. And you've got myriad organisms, fungal organisms, and you've got bacteria, and you've got protista, and for sure you're going to have some viral particles in there, and so on and so forth. It's just a world that is incredibly complex, even at that scale. A very tiny particle of soil would have all of those things going on, and they're interacting through commensalism and competition and predation, and all of the things that we see on this grander, larger scale in our daily lives are going on that smaller scale in soil. So those are different settings wherein you can find microbes. And then around here they have different things like this temperature scale. This thermometer indicates temperature, heat, and the amount of it varies from place to place on the planet. Incredibly important in determining who can live there and how well they function. So temperature. And then pH is another non-living sort of physical factor that or chemical factor rather, that determines the suitability of a given setting for a particular organism. And it mentions here that the pH content of different environments ranging from, say, 0 to 11 are places where you might expect to find organisms living. pH scale actually runs from 0 all the way up to 14. So I guess the indication here is that pH is exceeding the pH of 11 or just too inhospitable for organisms to exist, and so we wouldn't find them there. But that range from 0 to 11, is very broad. Of course, most organisms are going to seek out conditions right around in that neutral zone, which is about a pH of 7. In fact, your pH in your body in most compartments runs about that, 7.4 or something. A few compartments, of course, where it's much more acidic, like in your stomach, but that's not going to affect what's going on in the body. But yeah, so pH has to be managed. You either have to seek out an appropriate pH, or you have to modify the pH of your environment to provide those conditions that you need. The pH and temperature and gases, oxygen and others, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, all of those things are going to have a bearing on, and of course light. Sunlight is a physical factor. So embodied in that little picture there are all of these different environmental components, and little bit on how they promote life or limit life, case may be. All right, so among the chemical factors that are going to impinge on organisms are these different chemical substances, nutrients that have to be acquired from the environment and which are used in cellular activities. So an organism's nutrition is something we want to know for everything that we would encounter as a microbiologist. We'd want to know at some point what it is it takes for them to persist. And so that's organisms' nutrition, what they're absorbing or what they're ingesting, utilizing for energy and building materials and so on. So among those chemical substances, among those nutrients are those that are regarded as essential. And that word essential means, absolutely necessary. They've got to have them. But also there's a connotation that goes beyond that. What it means is that the nutrients have to be provided for the organism. So there are chemicals that an organism needs that they can synthesize on their own. And there are chemicals that an organism needs that they've got to get from the surroundings. And that latter class, these essential nutrients, are ones that they have to get from digestion or absorption. Can't make them, they get them from outside sources. And so of those things, there are two different categories that can be identified. One would be the macronutrients. The prefix macro here means big. And sometimes people assume that means we're talking about large molecules. But no, that's not what it means. Instead, big here refers to the amount that's required. So large quantities of these nutrients are required, so they're macronutrients. If you were to take the nutritional requirements in total for a given organism and write them out and give percentages of each, percentages of these macronutrients would be really large. Of all the nutrients they're taking in, percentages of these would be like in the tens or higher. Certainly not trace nutrients that are required in small amounts. So for sure, proteins and carbohydrates. The chief one of the carbohydrates is glucose, and most organisms really run on that as their primary fuel. Proteins, which are needed for forming enzymes and structural proteins and so on, those are needed in large amounts, not only because they're used directly in those roles, but because they contain substances like nitrogen and carbon and so on that can be utilized. So macronutrients. And then we got the micronutrients, which are required in very small amounts. Now they're essential, they're absolutely needed, but if you were to try to measure the amounts of these that are used on a daily basis by a particular organism, it'd be almost immeasurable. Right? So very tiny amounts are what would be needed. So a little would go a long way. These are also sometimes referred to as the trace elements. And typically, these aren't molecules. They aren't collections of atoms, but they are single atoms in many cases, not all, in many cases. And typically, if you were to look at them in the periodic table, if you were to try to find these elements there, they're going to be located mainly to the left side where you have a lot of metals or metalloids. And so these are your micronutrients. And so you've got things like manganese, which is an element, right? It's a substance that contains atoms of just this one kind. You can't break it down into multiple different kinds of atoms. It's an element that exists in the Earth's crust. And it's not terribly abundant, but it is something that organisms, their metabolic machinery can utilize. So we've got manganese, another one that has a name that's similar, not listed here, but which is incredibly important, is magnesium. Some people actually supplement their daily intake of nutrition with magnesium supplements. Magnesium is used in much the same way as manganese, as is zinc and nickel, and you got things like copper and iron, right? And I won't write it out here because I've run out of room. But molybdenum, try saying that 10 times real fast. Molybdenum. If you're in the UK, you'd say molybdenum. But these are all different elements. And the thing about all of these metals is that when they're active, they become ionic. So most of these are ions. And this is one of those instances where skipping over the chemistry chapter not to have been such a good idea. But I think you probably all are aware of the fact that an ion is an atom that has either more electrons than it needs or fewer electrons than it would have to be just in a neutral state. So it's an atom with a charge, right? And they can be negatively charged or positively charged. In the case of all of these metals here that I've written out, they typically are positively charged. So for example, magnesium, we would identify it with that symbol Mg. That's its identifying symbol. In natural settings, when it occurs by itself, it will be oxidized. It'll lose a couple of electrons and then take on this positive charge. So magnesium with 2+ charges is typically what we would see. Iron sometimes exists in Fe is its symbol. It sometimes exists in a +2 state. We call these oxidation states. And also another one is +3. Those are different states of the iron atom, and so on and so forth. So these guys typically have a little bit of a charge. And here I'll go ahead and explain how it is they function. Let me insert slide here. All right, so how do these trace elements, these micronutrients, work? Well, often they serve as cofactors. Call them cofactor ions. That makes it a little more specific, less confusing maybe. So a lot of these metals, magnesium, manganese, iron, copper, on and on and on, molybdenum, boron, these are often cofactors. And so they work in concert with enzymes, and enzymes are big old proteins, so big globular proteins, raw enzyme. Like a little, you're familiar with the arcade game Pac-Man. It looks like a little Pac-Man figure, and you can see these globs of protein, if you will, that represents enzymes. So these globs of protein that serve as enzymes, the catalysts of biochemical reactions, have on their surface little indentions or depressions, right? And one of those is going to be the active site, and that's where some chemical substrate is going to bind that will be altered metabolically, either broken down or added to something else. So that's where your substrate would bind. But then you'll have other places on that enzyme where other things bind. And so these are away from the active site, somewhere else on the enzyme, and we call these allosteric sites. So what can bind in there might be one of these cofactors. So let's say this particular enzyme has a cofactor, which is magnesium. And the thing about it is, if an enzyme has to have a particular cofactor and it's not available to fit in that allosteric site, often what that means is the active site is going to be misshapen and non-functional for whatever, binding whatever substrate it should bind. So with this enzyme conformed properly with the magnesium cofactor added to the allosteric site, its substrate will fit in here nice and neat like a key in a lock, or two puzzle pieces coming together. But if you were to remove the cofactor, let's say it's not available, gets cut out of there, or it's just not available. What happens is this active site here becomes misshapen. So the active, my substrate. What will happen is this active site will be misshapen. Instead of being nice and properly shaped to accept the substrate, it'll maybe do something like this. All right. Plug the cofactor in, and that fixes it. All right. That'll cause it to be shaped properly. Okay. So that's kind of what cofactors do. They help to kind of place tension in this enzyme in such a way that it conforms properly to accept the substrate as it should. Now, there's more to it than that, but that's often what they do. That's one way that cofactor ions function, in helping to give that enzyme the proper shape. And if it can bind the substrate, then that substrate can be metabolized, right? Super important. See what I have back here. So, we've got the macro and the micronutrients that are essential. Another way to designate nutrients is on the basis of their chemical makeup, not necessarily how much is needed, macro versus micro, but in terms of how they're structured. Of course, this is pretty simple. You've got organic nutrients, and the thing about organic nutrients is that they have at least some carbon, usually a lot of it, at least some hydrogen. And if they have those two, if you got a molecule, a compound that contains those two, we can say it's organic. But more often than not, you're also going to have oxygen in there. So I would say organic molecules generally have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These two are essential. So if we're calling something an organic molecule, they've got to have carbon and hydrogen. You can see the simplest one of those would be methane. There are some few microbes that utilize that. Some of them produce it. Others can actually utilize it as be a very simple organic nutrient that some organisms can utilize. More often than not, they're going to require something that has both carbon, or it has all three, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Like, for example, glucose, which is C6H12. All right. And then you got your lipids. They contain lots and lots of carbon and hydrogen, smaller amount of oxygen. Proteins have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen at the very least. And they may even contain some sulfur in some cases and additional things. At the very least, you've got C, H, O, N in your proteins. And then the nucleic acids have C, H, O, N, and P in them. So those are all organic because they all have carbon and hydrogen at the very least. All right, so organic nutrients, often these also are macronutrients, things that are needed. Now, inorganic nutrients are things that don't have carbon and hydrogen together. Some of them do have just carbon, like CO2, carbon dioxide. That's utilized by many photosynthetic organisms as the sort of substrate from which sugars are made. When they photosynthesize and make sugar, they use carbon dioxide as a raw material for that. This is inorganic. Inorganic misses the boat on being organic because it doesn't have any hydrogen. There's no hydrogen. No hydrogen in there. There's carbon, but carbon itself is not enough to qualify it as organic. So that one, that's sort of a technicality there. But no, it is inorganic. And then everything else here you can see doesn't have any carbon with it. Sulfate is got a magnesium atom, it's got some sulfur, and it's got some oxygen, nitrate, no carbon in there, no hydrogen. Inorganic, and likewise with these other things. Many of the inorganic nutrients contain things that are needed in small amounts, and so would qualify as micro types of nutrients. Well, there's different ways of designating nutrients: macro, micro, organic, inorganic. There's probably some other ways to categorize them, but those are some of the major. So, you've got all those elements out there, and they're brought into cells, and they're utilized to structure the cell and to run the cell's machinery. So if you look at all the chemicals that are in a cell, in the cytoplasm at least, you've got a tremendous amount of water. And that's important because, as I've said before, and not really spent a lot of time on, but I've mentioned that water provides a lot of the properties for life. A temperature buffer, which means that it keeps temperature regulated. If you've got a lot of water available in some system, that system's temperature is not going to go wildly up or down. Take away the water, you get wild temperature fluctuations. It's simple as that. Water is a good solvent. So that if you're producing wastes, you can dissolve them in some water and get rid of them. Or if you're wanting chemical reactions to occur in a cell, the reactants can dissolve in the water and react a whole lot better than they would otherwise. Try mixing two dry, powdered reactants sometime in a test tube at room temperature and seeing what happens. Probably nothing will happen. Add a little water to dissolve them means they're going to be able to interact a whole lot better. Certainly if you add some heat, that's going to cause a reaction to go rapidly. Water's often required for that. So it's the medium in which chemical reactions take place that owes to its properties as a solvent. And there are other things about water that are essential as well, but yeah, you got to have it. It's important. And then proteins, you got enzymes, you got structural proteins, which, as one might just guess, they're used to build structure. The cytoskeleton, receptors in cell membranes, proteins that are used for carrying materials around from one place to another in a cell. Lots of different utilizations of those structural proteins. And the enzymes are the things that are used to make chemical reactions go forward. So they're the catalysts. And these are hugely important. Without either one of those, life for that cell is not going to be possible. Not going to be able to maintain metabolism, or it won't be able to maintain homeostasis. Then if you look at all the different chemicals that are there, proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids, and you look at their components, look at the elements that go into forming them, you see these ones here, sort of the big six, and you can take the first letters of the names of these, their symbols, their elemental symbols, and use them to write out this nonsense word sponge. These are the sponge elements. Some people mix these up and they come up with this word chinops. The chinops elements or the sponge elements, or you can form those into another word. By all means, go ahead. But what that represents are these big six among the elements that are required by cells. It's certainly not all of them. Missing from the list are things like calcium, you need that. Sodium, you need that. Magnesium and those other micronutrients, they're all needed, but the ones that are needed in large amounts are these guys: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen, right? Sponge elements. Got those available, then it's a good bet that you can build most of the parts of cells and get that cell to run. So yeah, here's all the different nutrients, the elements from which they're built, and then these are compounds in many cases, or ions from which these these are built from these elements over here. So you got carbonates and other organic compounds built from carbon or CO2. And then all of these different nitrogen-containing substances are derived ultimately from the element nitrogen, so on and so forth. And you can see where in nature these things are going to be found, that places from which these things can be taken. They're often referred to as reservoirs. We often think of a reservoir as like a lake or a body of water, but in another context, you can think of it as a reservoir as just an accumulation of anything that's important. So various reservoirs of these elements and the compounds derived from them include things like the air and soil and different waters and rocks and so on. These are the non-living compartments, if you will, in which these can often be found. Different elements. There's some variation in terms about where they're most abundant. And then over here, it talks about why these things are vital. So this is something that you can review on your own. I'm not going to spend a whole lecture on just this table, but it's a good one, kind of size, and really drive home the importance of these different elements. All right, so obtaining essential nutrients is done in different ways by different organisms. And among those things that are really essential, obviously, would be carbon, needed for building organic molecules and so on. And because carbon arguably is the most important of all of these nutrients, the way that it's acquired, the acquisition of carbon, has been the basis from which we categorize different organisms. One of the most obvious ways to categorize organisms is on the basis of how they get their carbon, right? So these terms are probably familiar to most of you. We've got the term heterotroph. So it's got two roots. Troph in here means eating. You can see that's in both of these words, hetero and autotroph. Hetero Here, that prefix means other, right? So if you're a heterotroph, you're getting your carbon by eating things from outside of your body. So other organisms or other um, entities, they have to be absorbed or ingested, and the carbon in them is assimilated. So the upshot here is that a heterotroph is not going to actually make anything with carbon in it without first acquiring that carbon from outside sources. Right? You got to obtain their carbon already organic form from other things, things that are either currently living or were once living. So you are a heterotroph. Um, an amoeba, which lacks any photosynthetic mechanisms, would be a heterotroph. A fungus would be a heterotroph. So these are all heterotrophs. Now, an autotroph, and this is a special category of organisms because it's kind of limited, but autotrophs are organisms that use CO2. What did we say about CO2? It's inorganic. CO2 is inorganic. All right, and it's the substrate from which organic materials can be made. All right, so autotrophs take in CO2 as their premier carbon source, and then they start sticking hydrogens on it somehow or other and form an organic molecule. So the process of doing that, taking CO2 and adding hydrogens from wherever, say other compounds, X, whatever those are that contain hydrogen, when you plug the hydrogens onto the carbon and you form some molecule that has some amount of hydrogen and some amount of nitrogen in it, or oxygen in it, excuse me, that process is reduction. So the carbon in the carbon dioxide is reduced to form an organic molecule. Hey, you might extend, you're on your toes and astute here if you're thinking about this very intensively. You might see that there's an opposing type of reaction called oxidation. What is that? Well, in essence, oxidation is removing hydrogen from something else. All right. So if you were to say, for example, have some glucose in your cells, T6H12O6 is what that's supposed to be. Obviously, let me erase that 12 there. Nothing else will get good with drawing with my finger. T6H12O6, if you oxidize that, you pull the hydrogens off the carbon and you produce CO2. Use the hydrogens and they go away and they're taken up by oxygen and you get some water as a result. So why is this an oxidation? Well, these guys were taken away from the carbon. All right, so oxidation is essentially that. It's removing hydrogens, and reduction is adding hydrogen. That's one way to look at it. Okay. And so what do autotrophs do? They do a lot of this reduction. What do heterotrophs do? They do a lot of this oxidation. All right. And that's way oversimplifying things, I know. But got the heterotrophs and the autotrophs. Heterotrophs use organic sources of carbon, and autotrophs get their carbon from inorganic sources, principally CO2. All right, and then I forgot about this, but this particular PowerPoint has included here this slide on growth factors. And so any organism, whether it's autotrophic or heterotrophic, may benefit from some organic nutrients that they take in that are essential, and they're regarded as growth factors. So if you're heterotrophic or autotrophic, these can be of some degree of importance to you. But these are organic compounds that cannot be synthesized by an organism. They are growth factors. And among them would be a variety of essential amino acids, nitrogen-containing organic molecules, things like glycine, proline. There's a number of them that are essential. There's 20 different amino acids that are commonly used by organisms for the building blocks of protein and so on. So if an organism doesn't get those as part of the nutritional intake, they're probably going to fail. And likewise with vitamins. Now, vitamins are organic, but they are neither protein or nucleic acid. They're in a class unto themselves. They do contain nitrogen. The amine part here comes from the word. Amino groups contain two. And deduce that these vitamins are two containing organic molecules. The word vita in there means life. So these are nitrogen containing amine molecules that are vital for existence. And they function in much the same way as a cofactor ion. They're often used as organic molecules to provide similar kinds of beneficial effects, similar to cofactors. They're called coenzymes. They work in concert with enzymes to help them to function. These are growth factors. An organic molecule that's essential that a cell has to have and has to be provided for it. It can't make it on its own. Would be a growth. Sometimes when we make media for bacteria, we include some of these things. If we're making up a media specifically used to grow a particular kind of bacteria or fungi or whatever, we might add appropriate growth factors that we know that organism. All right, so that got plugged in there. We were talking about heterotrophs and autotrophs. Probably ought to reposition that slide, but that is something that you should know what a growth factor is. All right, so there's heterotrophs and autotrophs. Heterotrophs get their carbon from organic things that they've either absorbed or ingested, and autotrophs get their carbon from carbon dioxide, which is inorganic. Now, another way to look at nutritional types of organisms is on the basis of where they're getting their energy. You got the carbon source as one way to identify a nutritional type, but also we can look at energy source. And so organisms that get their energy from chemical compounds, whatever they are, inorganic or organic, are going to be chemotrophs, right? And then organisms that get their primary sort of surge of energy, their boost of energy primarily from light, are going to be phototrophs. So chemotrophs use chemicals, and phototrophs use light to sort of trigger their metabolic processes, right? And so you can see that probably most of the heterotrophs that are using organic molecules for their carbon source are also going to use those same molecules for energy. And so heterotrophs, many of them, are chemotrophs too. In fact, we can combine those names into one all-inclusive name. Chemoheterotroph, right, refers to an organism that gets its carbon from organic sources and its energy from those same organic molecules, right? They're not going to use light. There's no light that they can do without it. They might have to have available for assimilation photosynthetic organisms which they eat to get their chemicals, but they nonetheless don't use light at all directly. So if you're on your toes again and you're really thinking about, what kind of organisms might be like this? Well, a good candidate would be you. You yourself are a chemoheterotroph. Animals are mostly chemoheterotrophs. Fungi are also mostly chemoheterotrophs. All right, so then you can put these together in other combinations. So autotrophs, remember, use carbon dioxide um, as their main source of carbon. But if they were to use other molecules, other chemicals to get their energy, they would be chemotrophs. So there are forms that are chemoautotrophs. And so one thing for sure we know about them is they don't use light either. They're going to get their carbon from inorganic sources like CO2. Obviously, that's very foreign to you because you don't do anything like that. But what's similar between them and your cells are the fact that these chemoautotrophs use chemicals, molecules, and break them apart. They essentially oxidize them to get their energy. So there are forms like that that are chemoautotrophs. And you could do a similar thing with the prefixes photo, hetero, and auto. So there are some photoheterotrophs, there are some photoautotrophs out there. And that would cover all of the different ways of making a living in terms of acquiring nutrients and energy. This table here summarizes all that. You can see I was talking about the chemoheterotrophs, which you are, right? That use other organisms and the molecules that they contain as their primary sources of energy and carbon. Now, among the chemoheterotrophs, there are those that are saprobic. I've called these guys other things before. So these are the decomposers. Know that that word means the same thing as decomposer. They're eating dead stuff. Principally, those are going to be your fungi and bacteria and some of the protozoa like slime molds and things like that. And then you got some symbiotic microbes. Who are those? Well, in your body, you've got symbiotic microbes living in your cells. Those would be mitochondria, so they are a special case of organelles, which are actually originally forms that lived freely in the environment, which now occur in our cells through endocytosis. You could think of those as mutualistic microbes. But then there are other things that are parasites and commensals that are living on and in bodies of hosts, which are going to qualify as chemoheterotrophs as well. So that you got the photoheterotrophs. They use light for their energy source, but they obtain their molecules, their organic molecules, outside sources. They don't utilize CO2 as a carbon source. They do photosynthesis. They're not utilizing CO2 as a molecule that they. All right. So then photoautotrophs, these are the familiar photosynthetic organisms, the terrestrial forms like plants and mosses. And in water, we have the true algae, abiotic algae, and the blue-green algae, which are bacterial that are doing photosynthesis. Yeah, these are our photosynthesizers. When we talk about something being photosynthetic, that's the group we're talking about, are these photoautotrophs. Then we got the chemoautotrophs, and these guys can live very simply. They can take up some CO2 as the source of their carbon, and use that same inorganic material for energy. They can break it down and provide energy. Chemoautotrophs. We got a lot of forms here that are microbial, especially a lot of archaea. and other forms that live around deep sea vents, which are very high pressure, very hot environments, very acidic, very caustic environments. So a lot of these guys are extremophiles. That's an interesting sort of correlation there. These are environments that are harsh and inhospitable and probably devoid of a lot of energy. So they have to make do with what they have, and that's what chemoautotrophs are best at. So these are organisms, like for example, that can live off of CO2 for their carbon, and then they can take iron atoms and oxidize those to get their energy. So that's very, very simplistic in terms of how they metabolize, but they are nonetheless living organisms. Another thing about these guys too, the chemoautotrophs, before I leave them, is that they are frequently among the very first colonizers of brand new, very difficult, challenging environments. So you have, say, a newly opened landscape following a volcanic explosion, a volcanic eruption. That new rock that forms, that lava, might first be inhabited by chemoautotrophs. And then as time goes on and soil begins to form, these other kinds of organisms will come in as new colonizers, and the community will undergo succession as a result of that. Well, these guys show up early on in that series of. Yeah, so here it mentions with the photoautotrophs, those that use light, some of them generate oxygen through photosynthesis, and so that would be oxygenic photosynthesis. This is what we're usually going to encounter. So these are organisms that can take CO2, take water with a little bit of light, adequate light to drive this. They form glucose as a byproduct of that, and then they release oxygen. And that oxygen came from the oxygen here in water, right? Now you can maybe imagine there are other organisms that live in environments where there's not a lot of water, but well, there might be a lot of water, but there's also another substance there that's similar to water. They in turn are equipped to utilize that. So you have some organisms that instead of using water will use H2S. Oops, apologize for that. I did that. Here, let me erase that whole thing. Some organisms, instead of using water as their source of hydrogen to reduce the carbon in carbon dioxide, they'll use H2S, which is hydrogen sulfide, otherwise known as rotten egg gas, which is pretty toxic in large amounts. There are some organisms equipped to utilize that. They take the hydrogen off of the hydrogen sulfide and add it to the carbon with the help of light, and they form glucose. Won't try to do C6H12O6. But instead of oxygen, they generate elemental sulfur. Little sulfur granules will accumulate these things. And so inhospitable, challenging environments are often those where we would find these kinds of organisms, say in the muds at the bottom of a shallow pond where there's enough light coming in that they can photosynthesize, but there's not that much water there. It's more H2S. So that's an anoxygenic kind of photosynthesis. So there's that. And then we get the chemoautotrophs, which totally survive on inorganic substances. For sure, they're going to use CO2 as a carbon source, but they might use sulfur as a sort of building material to provide energy and so on. Some of them use iron. Iron-loving and sulfur-loving bacteria commonly are those that are chemoautotrophic. This word litho refers to mineral or stone. So these are organisms that literally can live in an environment that appears to be just rock and little else. Adequate water and things they can use. And then we got the methanogens, which commonly are among these chemoautotrophs. Methanogens take CO2 and reduce it and ultimately make methane gas, CH4. Methanogen means produce methane. The gen in here refers to the generation or the creation of something. Methane. And then, like I said earlier, we've got the designations of forms that are saprobes, feed on dead stuff, detritus, dead plants, dead animals, whatever it might be. Some of these forms, occasionally, if they're taken up by another organism, um, you know, will turn on that organism, so to speak, and cause pathogenesis, cause disease. And so a few of them are opportunistic pathogens. Like I mentioned, some of the fungi that are out there, usually free living, but if they're taken up by a body, they enter through a wound or they're breathed in, the spores are breathed in, they can be opportunistically pathogenic. So that's true of some of the saprobes. Most of them are, in fact, free living, so they won't cause disease, but know that that's possible. Um, if they're opportunistic pathogens, another term for that's equivalent to that is this one down here, facultative parasite. An opportunistic pathogen, you're a facultative parasite. And there are some few of those among the saprobes. Most of them aren't like that at all. Some of them are potentially disease-causing forms. Now, if something is truly parasitic, they're going to always derive their nutrients from a host, and they are going to be chemoheterotrophs in all this. So instead of being opportunistic or facultative forms, that either cause disease or not, depending on the host and various things like that, these guys are always going to be pathogenic. So if something is a strict parasite, it's an obligate parasite, it's always going to cause disease. Fortunately for us, that's relegated to relatively few forms. All right, so got a lot of bacteria, like E. coli, for example. It is not E. coli. Something like, say, the measles virus. All right, it is an obligate parasite. Something like Bacillus anthracis. It's an obligate parasite. Oh, and by the way, most of these chemoheterotrophs utilize aerobic respiration, the most efficient form of respiration. This is oxygen-using respiration. Um, if they're eukaryotic, they're going to have mitochondria on board, and that's where the oxygen goes and is utilized in oxidizing glucose. An organic molecule serves as the source of both carbon and energy. In fact, aerobic respiration in most cases among these chemoheterotrophs. All right, so we'll look at this, and then I'm going to stop here and post this as a lecture, and then later I'll put up some more as time permits. So anyway, an organism is degrading large organic molecules to get both carbon and energy. All right, so those are the two things we need to look at: is where does it get its carbon, where does it get its energy? Going to help us determine whether it's hemotrophic or autotrophic or phototrophic or heterotrophic. And so this is a case where big molecules are being used to get both carbon and energy. That would mean we're talking about a chemo, letter C. A and B are discounted right away because there's no mention up here at all of light anywhere. It says large organic molecules that are the source of carbon. That discounts this one because forms are going to be using CO2. So that one's out. That one's out. Down here, and CO2 hallmark feature of a chemoautotroph. They use that as their source of carbon. And for the chemicals that they're using to gain energy, it can be simple things, simple chemicals, even just single atoms. That contrasts with what's set up here, large organic molecules. That one is knocked out. That leads us to, all right. Well, I'm going to stop right there. And like I said, you got your test up there. You can be working on that. And then this material, this will be um, uh, tested over next week. I'll put up a test on this, and it'll focus strictly on this chapter having to do with ecology, nutrition, and so I'll give you a heads up on that when that becomes. I'll be looking at. All right.